I've always believed in comic books and the importance of comic books for children, especially when they're handled right, because they had a pretty interesting impact on my childhood. The English have Shakespeare, and they're very proud of it, and the Greeks have their myths, and America has Superman.
It's like you want to treat this stuff seriously, not like an ice capade show or something. It just gets more and more away from making a film, and you're just, like I said, you're sitting in a room before you've got characters designed for the film. It's like they need it for the t-shirt, they need it for the cup, they need it for all that, and it's just like it just was crazy.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Up in the sky, it's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's Superman.
Yes, it's Superman, visitor from another planet who came to work with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
So once upon a time, Tim Burton was signed on to make a Superman movie titled Superman Lives, and it went all the way up to pre-production. It fell apart only just a couple of weeks before the cameras were meant to start rolling. And even as Tim Burton films go, they're always kind of wacky. There's certain things are going to happen. He's going to cast his fucking wife, or ex-wife now. He's going to probably cast Johnny Depp in there somewhere. It's going to be gothic-y and have vibes. Even his colourful films, the colour palette's very different, but there's going to be just some weird stuff that could have been picked up from one of his more obviously gothic films and dropped in. An example is Edward Scissorhands, where the suburbs is super colourful, but you're in full Tim Burton mode when he's up in his weird house that Edward Scissorhands lives in. Edward Scissorhands himself could have been pulled right out of A Nightmare Before Christmas and turned from claymation into a real living person, slapped on Johnny Depp's face and just be walking around. Clearly Tim Burton has his things. Usually, though, they're not completely bonkers. Other than visually and some of the quirky characters, it feels like quite, on note. Batman, all right, there was some wacky stuff in the sequel where, the giant penguin guys come and collect the penguin's dead body at the end, but kind of a normal film. This was long before grounded superhero movies were the norm, so it wasn't that wacky. But this film was just fucking nuts. So before Tim Burton was even brought on board, Kevin Smith was hired to write the script. So first of all, the studio head, you got to give him props, even if the film might have turned out shit. Already from the get-go, for a film that's going to be a big budget blockbuster, he's taken a completely different approach. The producer hired him, let him do what he wanted to an extent and be creative, but he had 3 basically hardline rules that had to be stuck to when writing the script. 1, Superman can't wear the suit for the majority of the film. It's got to come in way later, which straight away is just a weird choice. Not necessarily against it, but it's just an odd choice, especially coming from a producer. Do you expect the kind of note you'd get from a producer to be, yeah, you can get creative with the design, make it more of a character piece, whatever the fuck, but his suit has to look exactly like the comic books, and he has to be wearing it in like the first scene. Have a couple of shots where he's looking into the sun just so we can slap it into the trailers. You'd expect notes like that.
I had one meeting where we were looking at the suit, and the studio and the producer were going, they wanted to have him in like Michael Jordan shorts. The costume designer and I were looking at each other like, we almost died. They go, we see him wearing corduroy as Superman. Then they said, maybe give him boots, but on the side of a van, like with flames on it.
By him not wearing the suit, is it more of a study of his alter ego Clark Kent?
It ended up getting rewritten by different guys once Tim Burton came on anyway, but a lot of elements were kept. Some of the crazier elements that I'll go into in a bit. But comic books are an interesting source material for a writer, because if you're adapting a book, you got a book. You might be adapting a book that's already been adapted a few times, so you could borrow elements from the movies and a book, but then do your own thing. But comic books, there's so much stuff you can draw from. Completely different writers and creative people that have a go at Superman. Frank Miller did basically where Superman, instead of landing in the USA, lands in the Soviet Union and becomes a super soldier that helps him take over the world. One of the source materials they used a lot for this, once Tim Burton came along, was Death of Superman. it featured Superman wearing a black suit at times and eventually dying but coming back to life because he wore some sort of regenerative suit that brought him back to life, and he had a mullet.
Oh, wow.
Which is fucking wild. And weirdly, at least those elements were sourced for this movie. And once Nicolas Cage was picked by Tim Burton to be the star, Cage really grabbed on to that idea of this long-haired Superman and basically refused to do the role at that point unless he was allowed to do the shoulder-length hair version of Superman. Also didn't want to work out for the film. The way he saw it, Superman was an alien. His strength doesn't come from muscles anyway. It comes from whatever energy source is inside him or whatever. So he didn't want to work out and be buff, which pissed the studio heads off. But eventually they compromised by agreeing that he wouldn't be muscly, but his suit would really accentuate his muscles. So that was kind of like the compromise they came to.
So Superman was going to have long, luscious hair and be very high on cocaine.
Yeah, basically.
Imagine if Superman actually done loads of coke. He'd be a madman, wouldn't he?
Superman's like a voice that, as I said, will go around the world. And what do I want to say? You know, I got an opportunity here to take that voice and to say something positive with it. And so I think it's time to re-examine the myth of Superman.
One puff and they'll soon be in my grasp.
Not so fast, nicotine. If you want to go up fast, take one of these. With my X-ray vision, I can see the harm cigarettes do inside people's bodies. That's why I never say yes to a cigarette.
So going back before Tim Burton came on board, the second rule that this producer gave to Kevin Smith was that Superman mustn't fly at any point in the film. So I don't know if this was to go back to the very original Superman issues that came out, where he didn't fly. He was a much underpowered Superman, didn't have all his like weird superpower, you know, like where he'd bring out his time-stopping beams out of his eyes or fly around the earth backwards to turn back time and stupid shit like that. He himself as a character was a Deus Machina thing, you know, that writing trope of where you introduce something just to help a plot point because you didn't actually write something clever. He could just pull out any weird superpower that you didn't know he had out of his back pocket to do whatever he needed to do in any particular moment. But the original Superman series couldn't fly. He could leap a building in a single bound. That's where that famous old line comes from. He was really underpowered. So maybe they were going off that source material a bit and wanted a more old school 1950s version of Superman early on.
I wouldn't be against that, actually. The Superman that is in modern versions of like laser beams out of his eyes and Mr. Indestructible apart from kryptonite. I've always much preferred like a Batman who has no superpowers but is just rich and resourceful. Like, you know, I'd like to see a scaled down version. That would be interesting.
Overpowered heroes are always boring.
Yeah.
They're not that fun, like you don't gravitate to them. Marvel, it works more, I think, because there's a lot of them and there's a lot of villains that are equally overpowered. So it kind of balances the act a bit. But even then, you're kind of like, all right, so you got, what's that bitch, Miss Marvel or something? I don't know. I don't actually watch many of the films, but Lady Marvel or whatever her name is, basically more powerful than Superman. She just doesn't feature much in it because she'd kind of ruin a lot of the stories. But she's alongside Captain America, who is just kind of quite strong and has a shield. It kind of becomes a bit silly where you're like, why is he more of the main character than this chick?
Although Hulk's pretty cool. Like Hulk,
Hulk's legendary.
Hulk can jump over whole buildings and shit. Like,
But I'll tell you why Hulk works, because he's fucking interesting. I remember I used to watch the old cartoons when I was a kid. Brilliant. The like 90s era, I think they were cartoons. Brilliantly done. I think it was the same people that made the Spider-Man one. It's just really well done. But Hulk was fascinating because it really wasn't about the smashing. He'd do a bit of smashing every episode, and obviously it was cool, but it was this weird character study. It was that Jekyll and Hyde thing. You know, Bruce Banner wasn't a superhero. He almost never controlled the Hulk. Hulk was this alter ego psycho who came out and smashed shit and spoke like a fucking caveman. That's why it's interesting, even though he's so overpowered. Dr. Manhattan from The Watchmen, I think even Alan Moore described him as Superman with Asperger's, and that's why it's so fascinating, because it's this essentially a god who can't relate to any of the people around him. He does have emotions, but you know, he struggles to understand even the most basic human emotions, but he can essentially turn back time, do anything he wants, completely change matter and reality around him, but struggles to have a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Like everyone else. So he's a really interesting character, even though he's so overpowered.
He's like a recluse. He's like the kind of person that you'd invite to the pub and they'd be like, I really don't want to go, and they'd have half a pint and be like, I need to go now.
You invite him to the pub to watch the football and he kind of turns up in a suit and sits in the corner not knowing what to do.
That'd be like me. If Chelsea lost, I'd start exploding everyone. I'd be livid and I'd just leave.
Become 1,000 feet tall and like wandering around London.
No, I'd go to the actual game and start stepping on the other players.
The third rule he had for Kevin Smith was that in the third act, Superman must fight a giant mechanical spider. So again, it's just like whoever that producer was, you kind of want to just shake his hand because wacky ideas. But bear in mind, this wasn't the first Superman film to come out. There'd been a series of them. They'd actually become kind of a bit shit. They were obviously looking for a reset. So it's not like the first one. He was going wacky with it. He was trying to be different, trying to set out from the get-go to not just be a paint-by-numbers pile of shit. I applaud him for that.
What's the source material of it? Was this idea like an actual comic book?
There was certain, like I already mentioned, the Death of Superman. There was definitely a collection of different source materials they went off. There's been so many Superman comics, I guarantee he's probably fought a giant mechanical spider at one point. But I don't know, maybe this guy was just inserting certain wacky ideas. He had a vision, a less conventional one than the ones that had come previously. But it didn't matter too much because once Tim Burton signed on, he basically tore up most of the old ideas, kept a few of them, but went for a totally different tone, totally different sort of script. He said he liked the script, but it just wasn't his kind of film, and if he was going to now make it, he had to do his own thing, so he brought in his own writers to rewrite it. He was going for more of a brooding character study. If you need some brooding, get in Nicolas Cage. He's about as good as it gets at that shit.
With a character like that, without giving away too much, it's sort of like mapping your own country because the guy is an alien. He's from outer space. So what does that mean? Nobody really knows what that means. So it gives you a lot of space and a lot of room to create something. And I just want to start brainstorming, getting all kinds of ideas, and then distilling it down to exactly what I want to say with the character. And I think with Tim Burton, it'll have a lot of soul. That's what I'm going for.
Nicolas Cage came on board and, as usual, went really into the character, read tons of comic books, but also was reading, Nietzsche and all these deep philosophical and psychology books and just trying to understand, like, how to get into the mindset of this person who essentially is a freak alien on this planet with these people, has an alter ego where he appears as one of their race, but he isn't one of their race. And he is a massive Superman fan. Couldn't wait to make this film. He was devastated when it didn't happen.
Is Superman still going to happen? I know it's been postponed.
Oh, I don't know. I've sort of totally let go.
Yeah.
I'm not.
But never say never, right? Or do you?
I mean, I don't want to seem like that guy that's holding on for this part and wanting,
Right.
because I've completely sort of walked away from it now. If it happens, then maybe I'll do it, but I've sort of had to shift gears.
Even years later in interviews, he was saying this film would have blown everyone away. If it flopped, it would only have been because it was too ahead of its time. Like, it was just going to be incredible. He even named his own son, Kal-El, Superman's Kryptonian birth name. So, like, he was obsessed with this. He'd signed a multi-film deal, one of those crazy contracts they used to hand out in Hollywood back in the day where he would get paid crazy money even if the other films didn't get made. So he was getting to make a dream project, do the character he wanted, even got his long hair, and he was getting paid shitloads. So he was probably delighted. You can see why he would have been upset that the films didn't get made.
See, Superman to me is a character who is a misfit. And he's an alien from another planet, and he's trying to fit in. So there's a lot you can do with those feelings of not being normal.
Mate, I could do a whole episode just on Nicolas Cage. His film choices, as he's got later in life, are just so fucking interesting. That film where he goes on an island and he plays himself, and then Pedro Pascal's a super fan. I can't remember the name. I watched another one the other day that I just stumbled across. The Colour of Space. He's just such an interesting guy, isn't he?
There's some careers where it just makes sense. Like, you hear Michael Caine is going to be in the new David Fincher film, and you're kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. Heath Ledger, when he got cast as the Joker, that was a bit of a shock. Everyone was like, what? Like, that's not going to be good, and why Heath Ledger? That's odd. But Nicolas Cage is one of those people where you could say next year he's starring in a new Transformers movie, and it's going to be the biggest budget of all time. Or you could hear he's starring as a paedophile in a low-budget independent film, and they're being filmed back-to-back. And you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's probably what he's doing. Fuck it.
Although I did watch that Dream Scenario, that A24 one, where basically, like, some reason everyone around the world starts dreaming of him, and he's just like some random bloke. It wasn't that great. Like, there is going to be misses. Do you know
that's why I rate him as well. He's not afraid to make a bad choice. He will just work. If it grabs him or he's like, that'll be interesting, he'll just fucking do it, and he'll just show up and bang it out. I think he's been married like 40 times and divorced before he died. So you see his films where he's like, yeah, I need some fucking money coming in. And he went through his terrible era of Bangkok Dangerous and all those terrible action films he was starring in. Ghost Rider and shit.
Then again, he had some good ones like National Treasure. Like, National Treasure's sick. Do you know what I mean? Like,
what's interesting about this film is not only had some wacky ideas, it also was, as far as I know, the first planned comic book cinematic universe. DC was going to get ahead of Marvel, and the idea was that the new Batman, who had been cast and the new film that was going to come out, was eventually going to cross over either the George Clooney Batman that was being made around that time, which obviously was awful, so they probably would have tried to reboot that again.
Mr. Freeze one.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I quite like watching that.
It's fun. It's for knowing now, like, I'm sure when it came out at the time, people must have been like, what have you done? But so many great Arnie
Yeah,
ones.
Arnold Schwarzenegger would be like, slow down.
What killed the dinosaurs? I see.
I liked it, man.
But yeah, this was going to be the first universe. And it was eventually the idea that it would cross over, and then they adapt other comic book characters and have them all cross over. So I do think like this film would have been fucking nuts, man. Like it could have been a trip, and it could have spawned a whole series of films and got that whole cinematic comic book universe started earlier. The Marvel Universe gets a lot of flack for affecting the film industry. You know, there's always a Marvel film in the pipeline or out in the cinemas or about to come out. So if a little indie film is or a mid-level budget film isn't instantly setting the world on fire in the cinema, they can just pull it and chuck that one on. So maybe it gets too much flack. I don't know how much you could prove is the cause of that. But, you know, maybe it would have been bad for the DC to get the cinematic universe going like 10, 20 years earlier. But it's just fascinating, and the film has some legacy. Of all the things that actually survived and made it into another film was the mechanical spider. Of all things, Tim Burton kept that element in his script, even though he gutted out most other things. They actually created a lot of the prosthetics and animatronics and different size miniature models for this giant spider, and it went on to actually still be recycled and used in another film. Not so good film, but a pretty iconic film from our childhoods. Think of it. Giant mechanical spider. How often does that come up? What film are you thinking of? Early 90s.
I know what it is, but it escapes me, man. Oh, Wild West.
Yeah. Wild West.
Yeah, Wild West.
Wicked Wild West.
Yeah. We're in the Wild West.
I'd like to know, was it in the original script and they were like, oh, fuck, or was it like a giant mechanical something and they were like, we got a giant mechanical spider we need to use. It's not going to be in Superman.
Dust.
Yeah, it's gathering
Cost
cobwebs.
the studio hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, so how about that? Or did they just sort of turn to him and be like, listen, we got to use this mechanical spider. We paid loads for it. Fucking make it work in your script. And he was like, well, I'm making a Western here. It's just interesting out of all the things from that film's production and pre-production and everything and all the ideas swirling around on it, that was the thing that actually made it into another film. Which I think, rather than Will Smith on a horse toting a gun, Superman fighting that spider would have been a lot cooler.
Yeah, 100%, mate.
Can we please buy some Superman peanut butter? Superman, our brand's fine.
Have you ever tasted Superman peanut butter?
Well, no. It smells like fresh roasted peanuts. Delicious, rich and creamy.
That's its strength. It's great taste. Nutritious too.